I'm the Director of Children, Youth, and Family Strategies here at Catholic Charities USA. You are joining us on the last series, last webinar in a four-part series centered around self-care. And this is the last one is on organization. So this one is called Organizational Self-Care, Learning to Care the Right Way. And we're going to go over some housekeeping items first, and then I'll give the introduction. Go ahead.
Welcome, everybody. We're just going to go quickly over some housekeeping items. This webinar, just to remind you that this webinar is being recorded, and your line has been muted automatically as soon as you join the webinar, just to keep the quality of this training. All the questions will be answered at the conclusion of the webinar. So please, if during the presentation you have any question or you have any comment, please send it to us via the chat box or raise your hands, and we will be able to open the line for you at the end of the webinar, and so you can directly ask your question to the presenter. If we run out of time, we will make sure to follow up in a written response for all of you. Also, it's one of the best practices that we do for our webinar. We send a follow-up email with the links to the recording and the slides. So we will do the same for this webinar as well. If you have any issues with the audio, I have the conference line is on your screen, and also the access code. And also you can find it if you go to the chat box in case you have any issue and you want to redial and connect with us. So without any further explanation in words, I will pass the control to Marlicia.
Hello, everyone. Okay, we're about to get started. I want to introduce a phenomenal speaker on our line who has been one of our speakers for our our four-part series for the self-care webinars that we've had here at Catholic Charities USA. I have here Jared Sanderson. He is a licensed clinical social worker who has more than a dozen years experience working in the nonprofit social services field. Jared has held the following positions throughout his time in the field: direct care worker, nonprofit social services. I'm a supervisor in the residential facility for children, foster care case manager, program manager for nonprofit capacity building and services to pregnant women program, director for foster care, adoption, senior care, counseling, and community education, and the executive director for housing development. Jared has completed play therapy certification, safe crisis management training certification, and also acts as an adjunct professor for the University of Missouri Kansas City's Master's Social Work Program. Jared's unique mix of frontline management and executive level experience offers a balanced insight into the field of social services, including the application of self-care at all organizational levels. And so further ado, I want to pass it on over to Jared.
Thank you, Marlicia. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. And presumably I have control of the screen now. Well, I think we're off and running here. Thank you, everybody, for joining. This is a topic that obviously is near and dear to my heart. I've been speaking about this for a while now, and actually part of the content today will be informed by some workshops that I've been able to do in different parts of the country. I've actually had the pleasure of doing this on-site for a few of our Catholic Charities friends. So if anybody from Columbus or New Orleans is on the line, hello. I hope everything's going well for you and yours. So I want to cover some of the content that we covered when we talked about support staff, because some of this leads into the way that we could handle self-care at an organizational level. But so I don't want to double up too much, but just in case people miss that one and don't have the time to go back and listen to that whole thing, I do want to just touch on some of the foundational bedrocks for self-care as I've come to see it, in a way that I think can be helpful, because it does lead into then what can we do as an organization to nurture some of this stuff. So individuals, regardless of what's happening within our organizations, but there are things we can do as organizations to support that as well. So I do want to spend more time talking about the second part, but I think it makes better sense to build up to that, even if doing so in truncated fashion. So a general disclaimer about where I'm at: our building tends to make some really guttural kind of noises in the afternoon. So if you hear anything like that, it didn't come from my body. I'm fine. It's actually the building that's making that noise, and so everything's okay. Also, if anybody can't hear me, or if there's anything like that, I'm covering any issues seeing the screen or hearing me, feel free to type that question in, and then Marlesia and her group can help mitigate what may be going on there. So if it's something I'm doing, I'll fix it. If it's something on your end, may not be able to fix it, but certainly let me know. So I do like to let people know who I am, just generally, because most of the time when we hear a voice, if we don't see the face, we to us, and sometimes that can actually change the way we hear the message. So some of you may have heard me say this before if you've been on anything that I've done webinar-wise or in person, but it's kind of an uncanny experience each time that you hear a voice, either through a podcast or on the radio, and you start picturing this person attached to it. And then when you actually see that person, if you ever do, quite often they don't actually look like the person that you pictured, which is kind of relevant to what we're going to be talking about today, because a lot of the impulses that we have are just wrong. They're off. They're based on previous experience and may not be relevant to current experience. And in that situation, it does have some implications for self-care if our initial gut reactions don't match reality. And that can happen. It happens pretty frequently, actually. So this is me, for better or worse. I do have a beard now because I started being a professor, and when you take a professor position, you have to grow a beard. It's in the bylaws somewhere. So today's agenda, pretty straightforward. I want to go over some just basic self-care research, things that you may not be aware of, things you may be aware of, but are specific to the way that we care, and really the neurology behind how we care and what we care about. Because it's my belief, and I think the research is starting to bear this out, that the way we view the world itself and the way we view our clients and the role in our clients' lives has so much more to do with self-care than the behavioral stuff. It has more to do with self-care than if we're eating right, or if we're getting enough sleep, if we're engaging in hobbies, if we have social circles. All those things are necessary and helpful, but all of them are contaminated if we're viewing the work in a way that doesn't allow us to disconnect from it. And that is central to caring. We're in this field most likely because we care about other people, and that's a great thing, but it can also be a destructive thing if we don't understand why we care and how we care. So I want to set that foundation first, and then talk about organizational self-care at 3 levels. One, in the HR process, so who we hire, why we hire them, and what we can look for to start building teams of people who are actually pretty good at this stuff out of the gate. Because there are some things that we can do in the hiring process to try to capture this right out of the gate. I'm going to talk about self-care and supervision some. Father Reagan covered a lot of this on the management side, so I won't spend as much time there, but I do want to talk about just some general principles in the way that we interact with each other that can either help effective self-care or can hurt it. And the caveat here is that quite often when we're not doing this well, it's not on purpose. In fact, it's quite often driven by sense of care, and it's just a sense of care that maybe we haven't explored the full extent of. And so while it feels right, it may actually be a bit destructive. And then self-care at an organizational development level, that term is kind of a suitcase term. So I'm going to cover a lot of stuff there, from the way that we fundraise, to the way that we structure our programming, to the general way that we train about self-care, because it's all relevant. It's all captured there. And specific to mission integration. What are we telling ourselves our job is, and what are we telling the community our job is? Because that's a struggle too. Quite often we have a misconception from the community of what it is that we do, and if they're expecting us to do things that we can't do, and we try to start meeting that demand. For example, if we try to be a crisis organization when we're not staffed to be a crisis organization, that can create some real self-care problems, because now we're asking people to do things they don't have the resources to do. So And then we'll wrap up with a summary. We should have time for questions. I only expect this to take about 45 minutes to get through. So we should have plenty of time for questions on the back end of this. So without further ado, let's get started. So some of you may have heard of the iceberg theory of leadership by Tim Elmore. This basic concept we're going to break down into self-care. This is typically used for leadership development, and it certainly has relevance there. But it has relevance from a self-care standpoint too, because I really feel like worldview really has a lot to do with whether or not we can take care of ourselves in the field. What we see our role as in the lives of the clients that we work with really does matter. It really does change how or if we're able to take care of ourselves in the field. And so the basic idea here is that with an iceberg, you've got 10% of that iceberg above sea level. And it's the 10% that we see. So it's the part you can dodge. It's the part you're aware of. If there are changes that happen on that 10%, you see it. But the vast majority of that iceberg is underneath. It's underneath the surface. We don't see it, but it's there. And without it, we can't really have the 10% above the surface. And secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue, the things that lead to people having poor self-care practices, those happen below the surface. Those are things that happen because our values, our belief, or our worldview has been impacted in a way that it causes our behavior to be different. And so this is pretty easy to illustrate. The examples I've used in the past is typically the way that we feel about someone who we feel like we can connect with versus the way we feel about somebody that we can't identify with. So we're typically more willing to help somebody if they, let's say they are trying to find diapers or formula for their child because they don't have a way to pay for it. We're typically more empathetic for that situation than somebody who's dealing with physical pain after being beaten up in prison because they sexually abused a child. Our initial reactions to those two populations are different. And they're different because one of them we generally can connect with, we can identify with being in their situation, and the other one typically we can't identify with being in their situation. And so our levels of care just immediately track to who we feel like we can see ourselves in. And this isn't me speaking in conjecture at this point. This is what mountains of neurological research suggest, is that we are just more caring for things and people that we see as in group. All of that is below the surface, and it impacts the way we behave. And so our typical self-care practices, they really focus on behavior. They focus on things that we can do behaviorally to keep ourselves healthy. Clean eating, healthy living, getting enough sleep, having hobbies, social circles. Those are all great things. We should do those things. But they don't get at the core of what causes people to burn out in the field. And we know this because healthy people burn out too. Physically fit people burn out. Physically fit people get frustrated. They deal with secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue at basically the same rates everybody else does. So here's kind of the conundrum that we face in our field, is that most of us are trained to navigate towards the people that we want to work with. So find the people that you're passionate about, work with that population. Growing up in social services, I say educationally, in both social work master's level programs and then just generally in the field, I've yet to have somebody tell me or give me the guidance, find the populations you don't like and work with them. We're always pushed towards the populations that we have some affinity for, which makes some sense intuitively, but those are the groups that we're most often going to sacrifice our boundaries with. Those are the groups that we're most likely going to be willing to do anything to try to help, even if it puts ourselves in jeopardy. And that's a problem. It's a problem that's bred out of care and kindness and love, but it's still a problem and a very big one. And so the reality is that we can't expect people in need to set or maintain our boundaries for us. We have to do that. And if we're expecting somebody in need to do it for us, we're constantly going to be overstepping boundaries because we're not going to have any. So if you were to flip it on its head and say, if I was in need, what would I expect or hope somebody would be willing to do to help me? There's typically not an end to that because I'm seeing it from getting my needs met. So if you're willing to give me everything you've got, I'm typically not in a position to say, should I really ask that of them? I'm going to take anything I can get my hands on because need is need. And when we're in that situation, we're just trying to get the need met. So we have to figure out ways to set our boundaries, even in the face of people whose needs may not allow them to see that we should have boundaries or need boundaries. That's not their fault. If you've ever been in a situation where you didn't know where you're going to sleep or what you're going to eat, or if you're going to have your house tomorrow, typically it's difficult to expand your thinking to what somebody else may need versus what you need. So it's pretty important that we start recognizing this, because just about everybody who comes to us and comes to organizations is dealing with some level of this. They're there in part because there's a population they want to work with, and that puts them in a position of being vulnerable themselves. So I'm going to use the term empathy, but we don't have to define it as empathy. I'm going to draw a distinction here in a second between trying to recognize when someone's in pain versus actually trying to feel their pain with them or trying to imagine what their pain would be like. So I'm going to call the first one empathy, which is trying to feel it, and the second one just compassion, just recognizing when somebody is in pain. But the definitions really don't matter. The difference is in the action. There is actually a big neurological difference between just recognizing when someone's in pain versus trying to imagine what that pain must be like. Those are two different things. And so that first one, trying to feel it, trying to feel someone's pain with them, that really does open up a bridge to experience their trauma. And that's how somebody's trauma travels from themselves to you as the listener. It travels because you care about them. And if you didn't care about them, there would be no bridge to take on their stuff. So empathy really does create a bridge for trauma to travel from the person who experienced it to the listener. That's how it jumps ship. That's what secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue are. Without that empathy, there is no bridge for it to jump. So this is the summation of all of that stuff, and this is the neurology piece of it that I think is so important. And this work, actually, I stumbled upon this 3 years ago, and since then, it's shown up in some pretty prominent books from some pretty prominent individuals. So Paul Bloom, psychologist, just recently used this work in a book called Against Empathy. It came out, I believe, the end of 2016. And Robert Sapolsky, who is just brilliant beyond all measure, he just recently released a book called Behave, and it's essentially a neurology of behavior, a history of how we came to be the way we are from a behavior standpoint. And he cites this work as well. So I feel a bit vindicated here that I'm not the only person that's using this. It's helpful to know that there are some really prominent people in really respected fields who see this as important as well. Applying it to our field, I think, is the next step for us because it is really important. So this particular study that's going to be highlighted here was done by a lady named Tanya Singer, who heads up the Max Planck Institute, which is a brain development institute and essentially a neuro study institute. So her and a gentleman named Mark Bowles conducted the study early 2000s. The book itself came out 2013, and it's actually a free online book. It's easy to access. It's huge. This particular chapter, I think it's chapter 16. Could be wrong about that. But it's free, and I would certainly encourage taking a look at it because it's just a gold mine of stuff that's relevant to our field. This particular study was done with random sample groups. So they took 2 groups of individuals, trained one of them in this idea of empathy. So trained them to try to understand and share the feelings of other people. So when they were told and they were trained that when you're exposed to somebody's trauma narrative, you try to imagine what it would be like to be in their shoes. So if somebody shares that they were physically abused or sexually abused, you actually try to imagine yourself experiencing the same thing. The second group was trained in compassion. So they were trained to just recognize when somebody is expressing feelings of pain, but don't try to feel it with them. And if you find yourself going there, as soon as you recognize it, pull yourself back out. And the analogy Paul Bloom uses when he talks about this is the analogy of drowning. You don't need to know what it must feel like or imagine what it must feel like to be drowning to recognize that somebody who's drowning needs help. You don't have to try to go there with them. And actually staying out of that space puts you in a better place to help them. So these 2 groups were trained, one in empathy, one in compassion. A third group who had experienced trauma was hooked up to an fMRI machine while they were expressing their trauma experience. So they were writing it down or telling it and being recorded. and their neural pathways were being tracked via fMRI while they were sharing their trauma narrative. And then that trauma narrative was shown to those two groups who were trained in either empathy or compassion, and those individuals were also hooked up to an fMRI when they were exposed to the other person's trauma narrative. So that's the backdrop for this study. And you probably won't be surprised at this point what the punchline here is. The group that was trained in empathy, their fMRI results when exposed to somebody else's trauma narrative, their neural pathways that lit up were identical to the neural pathways of those individuals who had experienced the trauma. So a little less intense because it wasn't them actually experiencing it, they were just hearing it or reading it, but the same neural pathways. So limbic system stuff, fear, frustration, anxiety, sadness, despair, all those things associated with trauma and negative experience. The group trained in compassion, their fMRI study showed activities in parts of the brain that are associated with positive affect, so frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex, problem solving, executive functioning, optimism. So the book itself, actually, this is a direct quote from those sections on 284. Training empathy increased negative responses to the trauma of others, and training compassion increased positive response to the trauma of others. That's pretty profound stuff. If we want to be helpful in assisting people in solving their problems, it behooves us to stay in our frontal lobes. It behooves us to stay in the problem-solving, executive functioning of our brains, and it definitely behooves us to stay in the hopeful part of our brains. It's at least for me, has been the experience listening to somebody's story where I've actually thought, man, I don't know how this person's going to do it. There's just too much here. And the moment that I start feeling that, I become less effective in helping that person because I'm not able to offer anything different than what they're already feeling because I'm stuck in the weeds with them. And so it's kind of natural to go there sometimes with people, especially people whose trauma narrative we see ourselves in. Either we imagine we could be in that position or we've actually felt it ourselves. If somebody's sharing something that you've experienced, you're more susceptible to falling in to that limbic part of your brain. And that makes us less capable of being helpful for most people most of the time. And so here's what it looks like on paper, essentially on fMRI readouts. Compassion really is healthier than empathy. The people who had experienced the pain, so the people who had experienced the trauma, when they were hooked up to an fMRI machine and they shared their trauma narrative, these are the parts of their brain that lit up. And if you know kind of the basics of brain development, that circle, that's basically where the brain stem meets the big brain. And so that's all of the early childhood development stuff. That's the fight or flight systems, the amygdala, that's where most of our visceral emotion is held, which makes sense. The survival pieces of our brain have to develop first so that we can survive, and then the executive functioning parts of our brain start developing around that. So anything in the middle of that, in the middle part of the brain, is typically going to be associated with fight, flight, fear, anger, frustration, sadness. So the people who are trained in empathy, you can see the part of their brains that lit up when they were exposed to somebody else's trauma narrative, very similar parts of the brain, less intense, but the same part of the brain. The people who are trained in compassion, some frontal lobe activity. So a little bit back there, a little bit in the limbic system part of our brain, but a lot of activity in the frontal lobe, where we have executive functioning, where we can actually problem solve in a way that's better than if we're stuck in our limbic system. So this is pretty important stuff, and it's important because hope also rests in the prefrontal cortex. Hope as a thought, when we hook people up to fMRI machines and ask them to think about hopeful thoughts, consistently the part of the brain that lights up is the front part of our brain, which makes some sense. It's really difficult to have hope for anything if you're not thinking into the future, and if you're not considering a bigger picture. And so when we're stuck in fight or flight or fear responses, we're typically not hopeful there. We're just trying to get by. So if we want to be effective for the people that we work with, we have to figure out ways to stay in the frontal lobe and to be hopeful for people and to be better at problem solving, executive functioning. So here's the challenge that we face. We want to find a balance between caring so much that we're stressed out all the time and that we don't feel like we can ever do enough, and just being apathetic generally and just walking right by people in need and just not worrying about it. Neither of those extremes work. They both put us in position to not be nearly as effective in the things that we say we want to solve. So we have to figure out ways to find a balance, that place right in between. And so we have this cycle that typically is empathy and ego working together. We have an empathy bias. We care more about people that we see as in-group, less about people that we see as out-group. That empathy bias causes us to be open to somebody else's trauma. Once we're open to it, if we're not aware that it's happening, we can start sacrificing boundaries. We can be working way too much. We can be taking on way too much, trying to do way more than our role says we should be doing for somebody. This can scale all the way up to the extreme of people trying to take people home with them because they can't find shelter for them. They don't want to be on the street at night, coming out of pocket for clients. You can scale this either direction, and there are gradations, but it definitely tops out sometimes. There are people, and there are some licensed individuals who have lost their license for doing things just like this. So good intent is not good enough sometimes. It is possible to do things, even out of care, that are either unethical, illegal, or just not good practice. And once we start that, then it's very easy for us to just justify it through this idea that we care. How could this be wrong? This is what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm supposed to be trying to take care of people. And then we're right back to that empathy bias. So empathy and ego really can create this cyclone of self-care. And it's really difficult to get out of because it's hard to question why people care or what they care about. So how do we break from this conventional wisdom? So we're going to move more into the stuff that I haven't covered before, either on site or via webinar. This piece I have, but it's going to lead into something different. So one, compassion is healthier than empathy in the way that I've defined it here. Dispassionate compassion is the perfect middle ground. Also heard this referred to as cognitive compassion versus emotional compassion. So cognitive compassion is more of that intentional care with a purpose, and emotional compassion is more of that reactionary, just going with the wind and hoping you land in the right place. Utilitarianism is a virtue. What we do isn't just feel good. If we're doing it well, it's both fiscally responsible and genuinely pragmatic. There are any number of studies that bear this out. If any of you are familiar with the studies around the cost of homelessness, it's really expensive for us to take care of individuals who are homeless because quite often they're accessing emergency services. So they're either having the police called on them, or they're having an ambulance called on them, or they're calling an ambulance themselves. They spend a lot more time in the emergency room. They spend time in inpatient psychiatric or inpatient substance use through an emergency room. They have the police called on them pretty regularly, and all of that is really, really expensive. Ambulance rides are typically somewhere around $1,000 per ride. If you stay in the ER overnight, you're looking at probably $3 to $5 grand. If you stay 2 or 3 nights, within 1 or 2 trips, that's basically the cost of somebody's rent for an entire year. And so when we house people, even if we pay their rent in full, it's actually cheaper than if we don't house them and they are constantly accessing emergency services. You can do this kind of math with just about every service we provide. Incarcerating people is really, really expensive. We're talking same kind of deal, $25,000 to $50,000 a year quite often to incarcerate somebody. To treat them in a way that typically doesn't, that reduces recidivism orders of magnitude, typically costs anywhere from $2,000 to $10,000 a person. So what we're doing isn't just about care in that sense. It's actually the right thing to do for functioning societies, and it's the fiscally responsible thing to do. And when we do it that way, it's so much easier to not get caught up in any one individual interaction, because some of these don't go the way we want them to go. Sometimes people don't turn the corner in the way we want them to. Sometimes they're not real happy with the services that we offer. All of that is okay if we're viewing this as one giant rock that we're chipping away at, instead of a bunch of micro interactions, every single one of them mattering the most in the world. So it's pretty important to see it this way if we want to stay out of the weeds of any one interaction. The last piece, we're only free to choose that which occurs to us. And so if it's not in our brains, we can't pick it. So what we're trying to do both with our clients and with our staff is to just expand the menu that our brain gives us for any given choice. And so if I were to ask you right now to pick any city or to pick any fruit or to pick anything, there are going to be things that pop in your head, and you're going to be able to choose from one of those. But there are going to be things that don't pop in your head that you are clearly aware of, but just didn't pop in your head in that moment. We don't know what causes that menu each time, but we do know that we can prime it a little bit. So if we give people different options this time, and we let them know that they didn't have to do what they did this time, then next time they have a choice to make a different decision. But if it's not there the first time, you can't pick it. And so that's part of the training that we do around self-care, should be around this idea that we're introducing new ideas so that the next time somebody's in the same situation, hopefully they can make a different decision. So nothing happens in a vacuum. When we're talking about self-care at an organizational level, all of these things fit together. So our work climate, our culture, so the leaderships, the norms, and the values in an agency have everything to do with self-care. Our policies and procedures, or lack thereof, which is, I think, sometimes even a bigger issue than what we do have on paper, is actually not having a way to cover something consistently from a policy standpoint. And then at a unit level, we have quite often within organizations, we have one big team, but then we have several micro teams. So we have different departments, different programs, and most of you, if not all of you here in supervision, if you're managing at a program manager, a director, executive director level, you've seen this. You've seen having multiple different teams in the same organization, all which each team has their own kind of dynamic. That's pretty important to recognize, because there are, I see this just within my own team right now. There are some individuals and some teams that are actually better at taking care of themselves than somebody that's sitting right across the hall from them in a different program. And so we can learn from each other, but the cookie cutter approach doesn't really work here, because some of these individuals or some of these groups are better at it than others. And all of this is infiltrated and impacted by hiring, supervision, and organizational development. And hiring is the first one. I mean, obviously, that's everybody that comes in the organization. The first chance we get to start creating this is who we let through the door. So that's what we're going to talk about first. So a few things here. Self-care and human resources. A lot of this is just my own experience at this point. We don't have a lot of good. There is some decent research on identifying kind of internal versus external locus of control, but all of this stems from the research on self-care on individual levels. So a few things I think that we can do when we're actually interviewing people. One is start trying to find people who have big picture thinking. So questions that we can ask in that setting is asking people what trend in the field they feel like will have a major impact on services in the future. If somebody can't answer that question, it's not an immediate deal breaker, obviously, but it may suggest that they actually haven't considered their role in any of this, and they haven't really considered what the field is going to look like in 5 years or in 10 years and 15 years. And stagnation is a really easy way to get caught up in a self-care trap, because things are going to change. I had a supervisor tell me a long, long time ago that I'm really glad that he told me that there were 3 things that are a reality about every job that you have. One is that no one gets to come in and do whatever they want. Everybody has to come in and follow some rules that they probably don't like, or do some tasks they probably don't like. 2, everybody has a supervisor. So nobody is just completely unaccountable to anybody. And then 3, things will always change. So if you're not able to deal with those 3 things, it probably doesn't work for this organization, and it may not work for any organization. But those 3 things are pretty important. And so then if you could change one thing about the field, what would it be? Again, just trying to explore some of the big picture thinking. How attached are people to the work themselves? The Goldilocks of care, trying to find that perfect middle ground between apathy and full-blown hyper-aroused empathy. I use this scenario a lot in this training, and I've started using it in interviewing people. This idea that the hypothetical that your agency closes at 5:30, you're not a crisis worker, somebody comes in at 5:25, they express a need. It isn't a need that requires you to do anything, so it's not a mandated reporting kind of situation, but it's a need where this person clearly has an issue. What do you do? Asking somebody that question, you get all kinds of answers. People who say that they will stay for as long as it takes, that sounds like the right answer in our field. It's a pretty dangerous one sometimes, because if somebody can't check out of the job when they're supposed to check out of the job, that can create some real havoc, not just for them, but for the people around them, because it starts creating a perception and a precedent that this is now the normal, that we never leave, that we're always on. And that's not okay. I mean, we can't expect people to never check out of the job, but then demand that they take care of themselves and that they be happy, healthy employees. So some other questions we can ask to kind of get a sense of where somebody's care intuitions are. What would you not be willing to do to help someone in need? Tell me about a time you went above and beyond for a client. Again, these are kind of trap questions because most people interviewing for agencies like ourselves will probably think that they have to demonstrate to us how much they care and demonstrate that by showing that there are no limits to their care. My experience, the people who are the best at this job can tell you exactly where their line is. They will be very specific with you when they will stop. So people who say outright that they're not going to come out of pocket for somebody, because if they did that for one, they would need to do it for all. Things like that are good indicators that this person has actually thought about this, that they've actually taken the time to figure out what they need to do to care for themselves in the field. There are no kind of magic bullet solutions here. There are some people who maybe would answer in ways that seem completely antithetical to everything I'm saying and still would be a good employee. So I'm not saying these are all pass-fail, but this is a way to start exploring some of this stuff. And this last question in the middle on what's your role in the lives of clients? That one for me is crucial. If somebody articulates anything other than seeing themselves as generally just a helper, I'm helping this person do what they want to do versus I'm fixing it for them. For me, that is a red flag if somebody thinks that they're going to save somebody's life, or they're going to fix somebody's situation for them, or they're going to get somebody a job. I know we may use that language and it's colloquial, but if somebody actually means it, it's going to be pretty difficult for them to take care of themselves in this field. Because not only are they going to be taking on the successes, but that also means they're going to be taking on the failures. And when the situation doesn't work out for somebody the way that we want it to, we can't take that on because that's going to happen a lot in the field we're in. The internal locus of control, kind of the same idea. Does somebody have the capacity to be self-influencing, or do they need somebody else to set their boundaries for them? We can actually kind of pull this out and tease it out in interview settings. One, asking somebody how they define success in their work. If they need to see positive outcomes from clients immediately, they're going to have a hard time in this field most of the time. Not always, but quite often when people make that change, when they turn the corner, it may happen years later. It may happen 5, 10, 12 years after they've met with somebody and something just clicks for them. If we have to see immediate change in clients for us to feel good about our jobs, then we're bound to burn out because we're bound to run into enough situations where it doesn't work out for somebody. And if we internalize it, it's just going to pile up. How do you determine who you help and how you help? Really helpful too. If somebody's citing their own personal experience, that I would want somebody to help me if I was in this situation, that can be dangerous because, again, you're probably not going to set limits on anybody else if you have a severe need. And so if you're trying to constantly put yourself in somebody else's shoes, then you're going to just justify over and over again that you should just keep doing anything you can up to and including bankrupting yourself, potentially, literally, but certainly metaphorically, on time and on resources. So just getting a sense of why people think they're here can be really helpful. And then please describe the last time you're really frustrated at work. That's a really good way to just start getting a sense of how people categorize some of the less desirable things that they run into in a work setting. So some red flags here. Again, the idea that I save the client or the client needs me, that's just classic Messiah complex stuff. We're not saving anybody. People sometimes need an intervention, but it doesn't have to be us. Anybody administering best practice is going to be helpful in those moments for that person. And so if I'm dedicated to the idea that it has to be me who helps this person, that's a pretty dangerous place. I mean, that's borderline codependency. So a lot of this I know sounds really negative. All of this happens with good intent. People are wanting to help, but there are better and worse ways to help. And we've got enough evidence now to know that. So we can start modulating some of this and start reframing it for people because some of this is actually driven by the external view of what we're supposed to be doing. And I think it's well past time for us to just in a very friendly way start defining this for the community at large too. That here's our role, and we can't fix people's problems for them. I got a call from a donor, a pretty prominent donor not long ago, asking us to go out behind the local Walmart because there was somebody back there that he thought was a veteran, thought was homeless, and he wanted us to provide an intervention, and this person was living in the woods. And was very upset with us initially because we wouldn't send one of our staff into the woods by themselves to try to track down this person that was allegedly living back there. That's not what we do. And if there's somebody who's going to make their donations to us contingent upon us doing that, then that's a donation we shouldn't take anymore because that's just not what we do. It's dangerous. It's dangerous to solicit in that way. It's dangerous to send people out in that way. And thankfully, this person was reasonable, and we had a discussion, but it wasn't, their intention wasn't negative. They just didn't know. They didn't understand that that's not what we do. Somebody who professes to go by their gut and by their instincts, we have evidence to know what the best ways to help people are. So insofar as somebody's gut aligns with best practices every time, awesome. Anytime somebody's gut is constantly at odds with best practice, that's a problem, right? And we want people to be selecting best practice every time because what feels like the right answer sometimes isn't. And so being willing to acknowledge what best practice is versus what we think our gut is telling us, I think is pretty important too. And the last kind of red flag for me is this arms race for care. If somebody is denigrating another organization they've been with because that organization didn't care enough or didn't care as much as me, I think that can get pretty dangerous. Most of us care, inside and outside of the field. Some of us have a different perspective on what it is that we're doing, and so it changes. But there are very few people who just flat out don't care. And so if I am in a position of trying to prove to everybody else that I care more, the limits to what I'm willing to do probably don't exist very well. I'm probably not very good at setting boundaries. Again, not always true all the time, but just things to look out for. That same supervisor I mentioned had a saying, hire fast and suffer slow. I've experienced that myself. It's difficult, especially for frontline staff when we have caseloads and we have an open position and everybody else is taking on this person's extra cases. I've been burned on this so many times. Hiring the wrong person is so much more difficult to deal with than having no person in that position at all. So making sure that we take the time to get it right and not just trying to fill a position with a body is a really effective way to continue to nurture self-care, because the wrong person, I say wrong, it may not be the right fit, it can just really destroy a sense of self-care and a practice of self-care in a team. It can't be rebuilt. It can always be rebuilt, but there's just no reason to take the risk. We're actually going to move through this pretty quick. Just one simple idea about gut instinct. Quite often our gut instinct is wrong. It's biased in the same way that our empathy and apathy is. So there's any number of ways to illustrate this. One is what I mentioned earlier, that quite often the faces that we assign to voices aren't actually what that person looks like, because what we're doing is basing our opinion on people who had a similar sounding voice in the past, and it's just not based in anything measurable or reality now. False memories happen a lot. We recreate memories now based on things that have happened between the time that we had the experience to now. And so we're quite often just recreating what we think we believe, and it may not match what actually happened or what reality was. So I think understanding your gut and then trusting it is actually better than just blindly trusting your gut, because our gut leads us astray quite often. So it's good that we are aware of that and we actually take the time to explore it before just making decisions based on instinct. Self-care and supervision. Role clarity is pretty important, and 40-hour efficiency. And so we should be encouraging people to get their job done in 40 hours and not be patting people on the back for working 60. And this is kind of endemic in not-for-profit world. If you only work 40 hours a week, you can be scorned. I've seen this within teams that I've been on, where people who are actually getting their job done in 8 hours a day were going home, and then everybody else was there late saying, well, how come such and such isn't here? In that scenario, nobody should be there. So we should be staffing our agencies in ways where we really can get our job done in 40 hours, and then we call it a week. And if we can't, then we should be exploring, are people doing more than they're being asked to do, or are we just overloading them? And on the frontline staff, this is, I think, really important to explore. Am I doing more than I'm being asked to do? If my role is specific to a person's case and I'm stepping outside of that to try to do more, that's not the agency's fault. That's my fault for taking on more than I'm expected. And so I think it's pretty important to do that, and it's important not to confuse those roles for our staff too. So if they are a crisis worker, then we give them the tools to be a crisis worker. If they're on call, we give them the tools to be on call, and then we recognize that being on call is stressful, and that the other part of their work life should reflect the times that they're on call, and we should be giving that time back in some sense. If you're sending emails or messages to your staff after hours, I think it's generally helpful to let them know in advance if you expect them to respond. So some of us just have kind of funky work habits, maybe binge working at certain times of the day versus others, maybe your schedule's staggered from your staff. If you're sending them messages after they're supposed to be off the clock, just letting them know in advance that unless it says in there that I need you to respond now, I'm just getting it out there while I'm working, and feel free to answer whenever you're working. So just that simple communication can really help on the self-care side. Supervision itself, requiring an agenda from your employees so that before they meet with you for their 60 minutes, they actually have thought about what it is that they need to discuss with you, can be really helpful. It puts them in a position of thinking beyond just the things maybe they wanted to complain about, and actually makes it more task-oriented. So then getting things done during that 60 minutes. So joint phone calls or emails. So if your employees need you to do something, if my staff need me to do something and I haven't done it yet, getting it done right then, if it's just a phone call, an introductory email, anything that can be done in 3 to 5 minutes, knocking it out right there. So it's not on your plate anymore, and it's not on their plate anymore. Last piece is really hard, but can really get in the way of self-care, and that's that personal life is not supervision fodder. Insofar as something is happening in somebody's life that is impacting their work, then we generally have human resources means to help. We have employee assistance stuff. We have things that we can do. But if supervision becomes a matter of somebody just sharing their personal life with their supervisor, that's a really great way to blur self-care lines. The last piece here is solution-focused. Task rundown is just a drag, so supervision is really just going through things that you're supposed to get done and identifying what somebody didn't get done. That's the drag. If we reach that place, then it's probably time for performance improvement plans. We should be talking about lead measures in supervision. We should be talking about skill building and ways to continue to innovate service and ways to do things better, and not just constantly reviewing what we're supposed to be doing and if we got it done. So if it's constantly negative or it's constantly deficit or tasks focused, it's worth considering why. Is that something the employee is forcing because they're just not getting their job done, or is that just the culture of supervision? If it's the culture of supervision, then we can change it. If it's something that they're not getting done, we can change that too, but for different reasons and in a different way. Things to look out for here, triangulation. So the supervision turns into kind of one or both parties complaining about other parts of the agency or partner programs or partner agencies. That gets pretty ugly pretty quickly, and it's antithetical to self-care. We should all be in this together. We're all working at the same mission. Groundhog Day. So this is a Bill Murray reference. If you haven't seen the movie, I'll explain it. If you have the same discussion every single month or every single week over and over and over again, that's potentially indicative of poor self-care, especially if that discussion is about self-care. And then supervision. If you find yourself having to spy on your employees to try to figure out if they're doing what's supposed to be doing, that's just not a good usage of your time either. So you're in a place where that's not helping your self-care if you have to worry about if your employees are doing what they're supposed to be doing when they're supposed to be doing it. So organizational development level. Recognizing pain versus trying to feel it. We can actually train on this stuff. And the groups that I've done this on site with, doesn't sound like they've actually had to institute a formal training. They can actually just going through a workshop like the one that I was able to do with them, just started a different kind of conversation. So talking about care in a way that distinguishes recognizing pain versus trying to feel it yourself can really have a big impact on the way that people deal with the trauma of others. Reasonable expectations. Again, if we are telling somebody that they are a case manager for this purpose, then limiting their responsibilities to just that is really helpful. If we don't limit it to just that, or if we expect them to do more than their position suggests, That's a problem, and it's definitely a problem if we don't then give them the additional resources too. Systems can be really helpful here. So client management systems, outcome tracking systems, and payroll finance systems, to name a few. If we have people double and triple entering work, if we have people that takes an hour to fill out their timesheet because they have to code 10 different grants, these are things that just pile up. They cause people to be frustrated with their work, especially in this field. If somebody was hired under the guise that they're going to be working with people and they spend most of their time on paperwork, or at least they feel like they're spending most of their time on paperwork, that can just be a real drag. And it can make those times where they're in the presence of somebody else's trauma seem that much worse, because they also have this other pile of paperwork that they have to get to. So I know it's hard because information systems change, and that's not typically where we have money to invest in the nonprofit world, but trying to simplify systems can be really helpful. Outcome tracking too. If we're tracking 1,000 things and only 3 of them matter, then let's just track those 3. And let's not have people filling out a ton of forms to capture data that we don't actually ever use or need. And this can happen because it just piles up. We've just been tracking the same stuff forever. It turns out we don't need to track it anymore, but nobody knows it. Team and not family. We like to say that our agencies are families, but they clearly aren't. You can get away with things in a family that you should not be able to get away with on a team. Teams have responsibilities. Everybody in that team has a role for that team. We can't really hold each other accountable if we act like it is truly a family environment. I understand why people say it, and there are elements of it that could be family-like, but it's really important to make clear that we are a team first. And I don't know if anybody else has experienced this. I've certainly experienced it in situations where we're trying to, we're putting an employee on a performance improvement plan, or we're just generally trying to address behavior or poor performance. And they say, well, I thought this was a team. I thought this was a family. I thought people were going to support me. And our paycheck is the support. And then we are paying people for performance at the end of the day. So if somebody's not performing, it's quite likely they can't be part of the team. And that's a more difficult message to pass along if we're talking about family in a way that suggests we're always going to be there for people the same way we would for clients. It's not the same. If somebody's not performing, they're not performing, and we have to figure out how to address that. And that's harder to do when we've set up this family idea. I know that it may sound a little controversial. It's not nearly as brash as I've maybe come across there. But team should be first, and team should be the focus. A few more things about this. Clarity is crucial. So what do we expect from people? What are we trying to accomplish, and do we allocate resources to match that? So if we are an agency that does services from 8:30 a.m. to 5 p.m., are we clear about that with our employees and with the public? Because if we're not, then we can have this bleed where people are expecting to work all the time, or clients are expecting us to work all the time, and we don't have a way to say no. So being clear about what it is that we do and allocating resources right there, and not asking people to do 1,000 things at once. This can happen. I mean, this can get difficult too with things like fundraising or donation drives. If you're a smaller organization, or even if you're not, when you're collecting school supplies or canned goods or things like that, who's doing that work? Do you have somebody whose dedicated job is to do that, or does everybody else get asked to help with some of this stuff? It may seem like it's just a volunteer gig, or that it's easy to do, but all of this adds up. Flexibility is pretty helpful. Flex schedules and flex work sites. If you can do 4-day work weeks or something like that, or allow people to generally just have flexible work schedules, there's a lot of good evidence that can be really helpful for people's self-care. But again, this requires hiring the right people. You have to be able to trust that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing when they're supposed to be doing it, which is why it's so important getting the right person. But if you have those right individuals, then you can give them a lot of freedom to do the job in the way that they need to do it to take care of themselves, because you can trust that they're going to get it done and get it done within the parameters that you've set. So some of this comes back to power and control. Once we have the right people, or we've trained them the right way, then we can let go. Then it's easier for managers too, and directors. They don't have to put as much stress on themselves to micromanage. And then there's just the consistency piece. Once we have that standard in place, then people can generally expect the same response to similar situations. They know they're not always going to be asked to work after hours. They know that if it happens, it's the exception, not the rule. And people are more willing to do that when it's once in a while versus 3 to 4 days a week. Mission creep is the last thing I want to talk about here. Small grants can often equal big changes. Generally, just the way that we approach funding can create self-care problems because it can really spread our mission thin. Well, quite often funding comes with the requirement that it be new programming. And so then we're trying to just kind of create something new, except for we really didn't get enough money to do anything new. So then it's everybody else in the organization maybe taking on a new task. So we end up with kind of these split positions. It's not that split positions can never work, but if we're just adding new tasks to what somebody else was already doing, that can create some havoc in that person's life and certainly make it more difficult to take care of themselves. This is true of private funders as well, obviously. We have a lot of people who are asking us to do a lot of things, and I think it's pretty important for us to ask that question. Are they willing to support all of it? And have we given them an accurate representation of what it's actually going to cost us to do this? Or are we just going to take as much as we can get from them and then just spread the work even thinner across everybody else? I think it's pretty important that we're honest with people about what it takes for us to do something, even if it seems like a small dollar grant. It's probably going to take a lot of work to track it and to implement new programming. And the last piece, do we apologize for things that we never said we'd do to begin with? I don't know if this happens at the organization. It certainly happens at ones that I've been at and worked with, where we end up just trying to do everything for everybody because it's easier than actually explaining that there are some things that we can't actually help with. And once we get there, there are no parameters anymore. We're playing tennis without the net. So I think it's pretty important to be very clear about what it is that we do, and then just reinforce that. This is what we do. This is who we are. This is why. And we can't step outside of it. Last piece here, positivity rules all. Some of you have probably seen this if you've been involved in anything I've been involved in. Andrew Newberg and Mark Waldman have done this study several times. Just flashing the word no to people on a screen for 2 or 3 seconds and then not giving them any other stimulation causes a cascade of negative hormones. So your brain just starts releasing hormones that are associated with stress. And that will continue until and unless there's an intervention. And it'll continue for 30 to 45 minutes for most people. Negativity is toxic. It kills your brain. It causes executive functioning to decrease, puts us in very unhappy places. So constantly reframing everything in your agency with positive message, positive outcome is a really good way to nurture self-care. Last piece, don't lie. Anytime that organization tells lies to its employees, we have to then try to defend those lies or continue to hide those lies. So to the degree that we can, being honest with our employees about why we're making decisions, providing explanations for why, even if people don't agree with those explanations, being as transparent as we can. Again, this is so much easier when we have people who kind of are recognizing the big picture thinking here. But when we tell lies, we have to try to hide those lies, and we have to continue to protect those lies anytime they run into reality. So just being honest with our clients and with each other goes a long way in nurturing self-care because it just creates less stress in all of our lives. So the summary, hiring, training, and sustaining. If we hire with self-care in mind and we train with self-care in mind and then we create organizational development with self-care in mind, I think it is possible to actually just have an environment where we do this well and we're not constantly cycling in this pit of burnout and then digging ourselves back out and then burnout again and digging ourselves back out. We want to find just a middle ground where we're constantly healthy and happy. And there's going to be some wavering, but it doesn't have to be a lot. And so that's the quick and dirty of it. If there are any questions, happy to field those now. I said it would be done in 45 minutes. I didn't hit that, but it's not quite 2 yet. So thank you all. If there are any questions, we can get into them now.
Yes, we have, I think it's one question. Let's see. Let me see here.
Start the recording.
Okay, so when will the recording, be available? It'll be available within probably 48 hours. So we will send out the recording within 48 hours. And that's the same question. So let me ask you a question, what exactly, have you, at your own agency, as far as when policy changes, have y'all implemented as relates to self-care that might have changed?
Was that question for me?
Yep.
Okay. So part of it is that we actually do this training, a portion of this specific to individuals as part of our employer orientation now.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about this stuff right out of the gate. We're letting people know that, one, we expect that people are going to get their jobs done in the amount of time that it takes, and we're going to actually discourage people from working more than they're supposed to work. We're already starting to nurture this idea that there is a huge difference between trying to feel somebody's pain versus just recognizing when they're in pain. And so we've actually built this into the employee orientation portion of our organization. There's also just now, and some of this is just law with IRS, people aren't supposed to be working more than 40 hours a week. And so if they are, we're supposed to be paying them. And so some of this actually becomes cost control too. Because we actually we do, some of us can't afford overtime, and if we haven't budgeted it, most of us can't afford it. And so I think that the first and foremost for us is just building it into employee orientation for everybody we hire from here on out.
Got you. Let's see here. Does anybody else have any other questions? This is the time to either type or raise your hand, and we'll unmute your line so you can ask a question. Either way. Okay. Well, there doesn't seem to be any additional questions, so you must have done an awesome job. Very thorough job. So I appreciate everybody for being on this call and being on this particular webinar. And thank you, Jerry, for all the work you have done for this 4-week series, webinar series. And again, everybody, this information will be on CCUSA's website with the recording and the actual presentation itself. So feel free to go there within like 48 hours and look at probably all of the webinars in the archive section as it pertains to the self-care series. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.